Prise du débat, continuing debate. The honourable member for Niagara Falls.
Speaker, we are 9 days away from Christmas, and the debate about the $400 million green slush fund scandal continues on in this place, despite the crisis in confidence we are witnessing in this Liberal caucus today and in this failed Prime Minister. Yet this NDP Liberal government continues to ignore your order. And this self-imposed deadline and the mess that they've created. And why is it that they're not giving up? This kind of steadfast resistance clearly tells us they are hiding something. It is the official opposition's job to hold this corrupt Liberal NDP government to account, and that's exactly what we're doing. Common sense Conservatives are determined to get to the bottom of this massive scandal one way or another, and we will continue to insist on getting those ordered and unredacted documents from this government so they can be presented to the RCMP. At a time when Canadians are struggling to put food on their tables, when the dream of home ownership in Canada is just that, a dream for many young Canadians, and when our country is plagued by so many other serious challenges brought upon us by the failed policies of this incompetent and reckless NDP government, including potentially devastating 25% U.S. tariffs on all Canadian products beginning next month. Here we are yet again this afternoon, debating this government's failure to live up to its responsibilities and your order, Speaker, to produce important documents pertaining to the Sustainable Development Technology Canada Green Slush Fund scandal. For those watching at home, this issue goes back 189 days to June 10th, 2024, when this House adopted the following motion proposed by Common Sense Conservatives on this important matter. And the motion read that the House order the government, Sustainable Development Technology Canada, SDTC, and the Auditor General of Canada, each to deposit with the law clerk and the Parliamentary Council within 30 days of the adoption of this order the following documents, created or dated since January 1st, 2017, which are in its or her possession, custody, or control. The motion then details what documents were to be supplied, and then directed that H, the law clerk and Parliamentary Council shall promptly thereafter notify the Speaker whether each entity produced documents as ordered, and the Speaker in turn shall forthwith inform the House of the notice of the law clerk and the Parliamentary Council. But if the House stands adjourned, the Speaker shall lay the notice upon the table pursuant to Standing Order 32.1. And the law clerk, the law clerk and Parliamentary Council shall provide forthwith any documents received by him pursuant to this order to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Yet the government refused to comply, forcing you as the Speaker to then rule in September that our privileges had been breached. So from that date on, we have been debating our amendments on next steps required to get all these unredacted documents so we can get back to addressing the issues impacting Canadians in all of our ridings. As we approach the Christmas season, here's a generous gift from the Common Sense Conservatives for all the other parties in this House. Our latest sub-amendment put forward by my colleague and seatmate, the member of Calgary, Rocky Ridge, will discharge the 30-day reporting period of the Standing Committee on Procedures and House Affairs if the Speaker tables a notice from the law clerk and Parliamentary Council confirming that all government institutions have fully complied with the order adopted on June 10, 2024 by depositing all of their responsive records in an unredacted form. That's right, Speaker. If the government simply hands over all the ordered SDTC documents unredacted, we can finally move on from this scandal and begin addressing the many serious issues plaguing our country. Speaker, it dismays me and leaves me in utter disbelief that the House of Commons remains seized by this issue and has been for an entire fall session. And despite ample opportunity, the Liberal government has still not done what's right and handed over the ordered and unredacted SDTC documents to the RCMP. Speaker, for those watching at home, SDTC was established by the government of Canada in 2001. As a federally funded foundation, it was responsible for the approval and disbursement of over $100 million annually in taxpayer funds to help Canadian companies develop and deploy sustainable technologies. For many years, SDTC operated responsibly and earned a generally good reputation for its work. However, that all changed in 2019 when former Liberal Industry Minister Navdeep Bains appointed Annette Verschuren as chair of SDTC. The issue at hand was a matter of conflict of interest. Verschuren was an entrepreneur who was already receiving SDTC funding through one of her own companies, and now she was appointed by this NDP Liberal government to hold responsibilities for overseeing those very SDTC funds, the same funds her company was receiving. That fact alone should have sounded alarm bells and red flashing lights to alert everyone in the government about this obvious conflict of interest. In fact, it was no secret. The minister, the Prime Minister's office, and the Privy Council office all knew, and they were warned of the risks associated with appointing a conflicted chair. Yet those warnings fell on deaf ears and indifference, as Verschuren was appointed by the Liberal minister anyways. How can you tell a government has lost its moral compass? When it makes poor decisions like this one without concern for doing the right thing and without fear of consequence. Only 2 years later, Minister Bains announced in January of 2021 that he had decided to step away from politics and not run again in the upcoming federal election. That same year, SDTC entered into a 5-year, $1 billion agreement with the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, ISED. Fast forward to fall of 2024, and it's clear that the Liberals are trying desperately to run away and wash their hands of this mess, one in which they laid the foundation through their own actions, and especially after the Auditor General released a scathing report about SDTC in June of 2024. The AG found massive issues at SDTC, which resulted in the current Minister of Industry, the Honourable Member for St. Maurice Champlain, abolishing the SDTC and immediately transferring its funds over to the National Research Council of Canada instead. These are truly astonishing developments in just 3 years for something this Liberal government doesn't want to talk about anymore. So what did the AG find that was so bad to cause all this carnage? In June 2024, the AG found that SDTC demonstrated, quote, significant lapses in governance and stewardship of public funds. Nearly 20% of the SDTC projects examined by the AG were in fact ineligible based on the government's own rules for funding, with a total price tag of $59 million. Speaker, there were also 90 instances where the SDTC ignored conflict of interest provisions while awarding $76 million to various projects. Indeed, the AG found 63 cases where SDTC agency directors voted in favor of payments to companies in which they had declared interests. Further, there were serious matters of governance, including the fact that its board didn't even have the minimum number of members required by law. The report concluded that, quote, not managing conflicts of interest, whether real, perceived, or potential, increases the risk that any individual's duty to act in the best interests of the Foundation is affected, particularly when making decisions to award funding, end quote. It also blamed the government's Minister of Industry, whose ministry did not sufficiently monitor the contribution agreements with SDTC. But, believe it or not, it gets worse. Far, far worse, Speaker. Since June, the Auditor General found that directors had awarded funding projects that were ineligible and where conflict of interest existed. The Auditor General found that over $330 million in taxpayer money was paid out in over 180 cases where there was a potential conflict of interest, where Liberal appointed directors funneling money to companies they own. Time after time, this Liberal government and its Prime Minister has shown total contempt for Canada's ethics laws. In fact, the Prime Minister himself has been found subject of 3 ethics investigations and found twice guilty of breaking ethics laws. This Liberal government allows the culture of law-breaking to persist, as 6 Liberals have been found guilty of breaking ethics laws. They've gone through these ethical scandals before. That's why they're withholding these documents, breaching parliamentary privilege, and trying desperately to sweep this mess under the rug and move on to the next thing. But common sense Conservatives are not going to let them get away with it, Speaker. We are holding this corrupt NDP Liberal government to account. They will be held responsible for their carelessness, recklessness, and indeed corruption. That is why on June 10th, 2024, the House of Commons adopted our motion, which has led to this ongoing debate in the House. And let us not forget, this common sense Conservative motion passed in this place with the support of the New Democrats, Green Party, and Bloc Québécois. Only the Liberals opposed it. To be clear, nothing in that motion ordered the RCMP to conduct an investigation. The House simply asked that documents be turned over to the RCMP. Speaker, it has been it's been 189 days since this motion passed. This is a horrible look for this Liberal government. Further, nothing in that House order contemplated redactions to documents being made by this government. That's because the House of Commons enjoys the absolute and unfettered power to order the production of documents that is not limited by statute. These powers are rooted in the Constitution Act of 1867 and in the Parliament of Canada Act. In response to the Liberal government's failure to produce these documents, the Conservative House leader raised a point of privilege, rightly arguing that the House privileges had been breached due to the failure to comply with the House order. In September, Speaker, you agreed, and now, nearly 3 months later, we continue our important debate on this matter. Speaker, you've ruled this government has violated a House order to turn over evidence to the RCMP into the latest Liberal $400 million green slush fund scandal. This Liberal government's refusal to respect your ruling has paralyzed Parliament, pushing aside all other work to address issues such as the cruel and crippling carbon tax, the cost of living crisis Canadians face, and the increasing crime, disorder, and chaos on our streets and in our communities and cities. On top of all this hardship, the incoming President-elect of Canada's biggest trading partner is now threatening our country with 25% tariffs on all Canadian products exported to the U.S. If this government fails to improve Canada's border security, to stop the flow of illegal immigrants and illegal drugs, such as fentanyl, from crossing into Canada's borders, what will this president do? Speaker, since the Prime Minister took office in 2015, 47,000 Canadians have died from drug overdoses. That is more Canadians than we lost in the Second World War. And it represents a 200% annual increase in drug overdose deaths after this Prime Minister's radical liberalization of drugs. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, it should not take U.S. tariff threats for our federal government to take action on this hugely important issue. But as we've seen, issues only become important to the Liberals when their political fortunes are at stake. Canadian workers, Canadian families, and Canadian businesses should not have to suffer the brunt of this pain and hardship caused by the NDP Liberal government. They deserve so much better. Speaker, one of the drivers of this hardship is the cruel NDP Liberal carbon tax. In fact, this carbon tax will cost the average Ontario family $903 this year. This is completely unacceptable to the constituents in my communities of Niagara Falls, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Fort Erie, who work hard for their money, who save carefully for their futures, and who dream of a better tomorrow. Instead of doing anything about climate change, the NDP Liberal carbon tax is impoverishing Canadians. Recently, the PBO confirmed that Canadians will suffer a net cost, paying more in the carbon tax than they will get back in the rebates. Unfortunately, the NDP Liberal government doesn't care. Instead of giving Canadians the tax relief they deserve, they hiked the carbon tax by 23% last spring, and as part of their plan to quadruple the carbon tax by 2030. And that's not all. They plan to hike the carbon tax again this April. It turns out the NDP Liberal carbon tax is not an environmental plan at all. It is simply another government tax grab so they can continue their reckless spending frenzy, which we will hear more about next week, or today. We were attempting to hear about it today when we would have had the fall economic statement, but we simply don't know where that stands. The SDTC scandal is also happening at a time when costs are up on essentials such as food. In fact, families will be spending $700 more this year on food than they did in 2023. That's because when you tax the farmer who grows the food, and the trucker who ships the food, and the store who stores and sells the food, you end up taxing the family who buys the food. As Sylvain Charlebois, director of Dalhousie University's Agri-Food Analytics Lab, has said, the costly NDP Liberal carbon tax, quote, likely adds a significant cost burden to the Canadian food industry. Speaker, food bank usage has increased every year this NDP Liberal government has been in office because of its inflationary spending and punishing carbon tax. This was confirmed recently by Feed Ontario, who revealed that a record 1 million people visited a food bank in Ontario in 2024. This is a dramatic increase of 25% from the previous year. In fact, Feed Ontario CEO told media that day, and I quote, "I never thought I would see this day." Across Canada, Food Bank Canada reported earlier this year that they had seen a 50% increase in visits since 2021, with food banks handling a record 2 million visits in a single month. In my community alone, Project Share, for example, saw a 20% increase in people served this year compared to the previous year. 4,740 people accessed their services for the first time. 120 families on average per day accessed their essential support services. Just think of these numbers, Speaker. 13,995 people were served last year at Project Share, which equates to 1 in 7 residents of Niagara Falls having accessed their essential support services. We should be debating these issues, Speaker, and we can if this government simply abided by your ruling and provided the documents this House has requested. Why are they hesitant to do what is so right? Is it that they do not want to speak to the situation facing young Canadians and first-time homebuyers, which is so bad that the Canadian dream of home ownership is dying? 2/3 of young people believe they will never be able to afford a home. Speaker, there are almost 1,800 homeless camps in Ontario alone. Crime is also getting worse under the watch of this Liberal NDP government. These issues I noted above and so many more like these, like the skyrocketing crime rate and all pressing issues, these are the issues parliamentarians should be debating instead of the SDTC crisis and scandal. But the House of Commons is seized because this government refuses to comply with the House order to hand over these documents to the RCMP. Speaker, it's time for us to get to the bottom of this, and more importantly for the government to respond to the House order to provide those ordered documents unredacted to the law clerk and the RCMP. It's time for this Liberal government to end its cover-up and provide the ordered documents to the police so Parliament can get back to work and Canadians can have the accountability they so rightly deserve. Thank you, Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion that we're actually debating is a Conservative motion that says we take the issue outside of the House of Commons on the floor of the House and have Procedures and House Affairs Committee deal with the matter. The member knows it. It's actually a Conservative motion that they have been filibustering for weeks on weeks on weeks in order to prevent us talking about the types of issues that Canadians would like us to be talking about. The member is saying, well, we should just do what it is that the Conservatives want us to do, and that's hand the documents directly over to the RCMP. The RCMP has said, no, don't do that. The Auditor General of Canada has said no. We have other legal experts that are saying no. Yet the Conservatives believe that we should listen to them as opposed to those institutions. My question to the member is, why does the Conservative Party continue to play this self-serving, for the leader of the Conservative Party, multi-million-dollar game at a great expense to Canadians? When's the game going to end?
The honourable member for Niagara Falls.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. Speaker, we go back to June 10th on this when the original motion was put forward, and we're still waiting for documents to be produced. Why is it? This could end tomorrow. We could be speaking about issues. For example, what could you purchase with that $400 million? A lot of border control. A lot of border control, for example. We're building a new infrastructure, a $400 million waste treatment facility in Niagara Falls, which is needed for the burgeoning growth that's anticipated there. That would cover those costs. We're building a brand new hospital in Niagara. That would be at least $400 million. But instead of talking of issues such as that, we're talking about why is this government so concerned with not presenting documents that can get to the bottom of this? What are they trying to hide? And why are they trying to protect these individuals? Right. Well, and this government knew, for example, Speaker, that she was in the person that they appointed was in a position of conflict of interest, and yet they still appointed her. What does that say about their credibility, and what does that talk about in terms of their judgment with regards to accountability and transparency?
I'll make sure that we'll make a robust questioning list. I'm sure the honourable member would like to answer those. Question commentaire.
The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Mr. Speaker, it's an interesting Monday, to say the least, rich in surprises and emotion. So I have a brief question for my colleague. Does he realise that this filibustering goes against the motions that the Conservatives tabled to send this to a parliamentary committee?
Of the Deputy Niagara Falls.
Again, I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question, but what we're trying to do is just get those documents. I cannot understand why we're continuing to debate. It's been 189 days now. What is this government trying to hide? By presenting those documents, we will present them. Well, I mean, they go to the law clerk, and then they will be presented to the RCMP. We're not telling the RCMP what to do with them. We're asking that they be presented to them. What is this government simply trying to hide? There are issues that we should be debating. I have 1 in 7 residents in my community going to a food bank. That's insane. That needs to be addressed. We have to get the economy going again, people working. And this government is failing to talk about that. And today, in fact, there's a crisis in confidence in this Liberal government, and it's Liberals who have a crisis in confidence in themselves. We need to be debating those type of issues, get the economy going again, and yet they refuse to allow us to do it.
Questions and comments? The honourable for Souris Moose Mountain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate it. If I might quickly just like to wish all the great members of Souris Moose Mountain a very Merry Christmas and a Happy Hanukkah as we go forward. And to you as well, Mr. Speaker. To my honourable colleague from Niagara Falls, who my honored colleague from Niagara Falls, who did an excellent speech, and I appreciate that. And he did hit the nail on the head on the issue of the reality of $400 million. And I'm wondering if the member might, when we reflect with what's transpired today and what the former finance minister said were costly political gimmicks. And I'm wondering if the member might comment on whether he sees any correlation between these costly political gimmicks and what we see with the $400 million that has all of a sudden disappeared.
Honourable member for Niagara Falls.
He's absolutely right, and the former finance minister said exactly that. If I could, I'd like to take this opportunity. I'll read from her resignation letter when she talks about, as a country today, our country today faces a grave challenge. Then she goes on to talk about That means eschewing costly political gimmicks, which we can ill afford and which make Canadians doubt that we recognize the gravity of the moment. That's what she said. And here we are talking about $400 million that this government refuses to provide accountability over. And you know what? There's another sentence she has in her resignation letter. But how we deal with the threat our country currently faces will define us for a generation and perhaps longer. Canada will win if we are strong, smart, and united, and that we have to be. But she also talks about this is a great line. She goes, inevitably, our time in government will come to an end. Speaker, I agree with that one line, and surely it needs to come to an end as soon as possible.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments, and then remember for Barry Innisfil.
Are you sure? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I know the honourable member is a big Bills fan, and yesterday was a big win against Detroit, so go Bills. Where'd that huff and the puff come from? Oh, okay. A New England fan, obvious New England fan. Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable member represents a border community, and the border has become an issue since President Trump's election. Issues of drugs, immigration, it's an important part of his writing because of the safety and security of the border, but also tourism is a big part. So I wonder if the honourable member can comment on the fact that we have a government that's literally collapsing before our eyes, and how important it is that we call on the NDP to show no confidence in this government, forget about the leader's pension, the NDP leader's pension, call no confidence in this government so that we can have a government that can deal with the crises, many crises that are facing our nation, and show some strong leadership in a Canada First approach. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Niagara Falls.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. Go Bills. And he's absolutely right. My community, for example, we've got 4 international border crossings. 2 of the 4 bridges that we have in my community alone are 2 of the 4 of the busiest commercial bridge crossings into the United States in terms of commerce, in terms of tourism, for example. Our community, $2.4 billion in tourism receipts alone, 2019 prior to COVID, and the majority of our visitor base, is domestic, but those international visitors, the primary visitor base is American, and they're over 50% of our spend. So what we need to be doing is taking actions to ensure we continue to facilitate American visitation into our country rather than taking steps that would damage in any way American visitation to our country. Right. The relationship in our border communities is also so close. The success of our auto sector, for example, I have in our community a General Motors engine plant facility, but there's also one in Buffalo. What these 25% tariff discussions going on currently, that worries me for those hundreds of workers at that General Motors facility in St. Catharines. If they're put in place, it may be economically impossible to keep that facility open and simply move those jobs to Buffalo instead. And that would be sad to see that happen.
Questions and comments? For Red Deer Lacombe.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm going to ask my colleague the same question I just asked the last speaker. This Prime Minister touts himself as a feminist, yet we've seen time and again through his leadership the axe has fallen on the women that he's appointed to his cabinet: Jody Wilson-Raybould, Jane Philpott, Special Advisor Selena Cesar-Chavannes, and now the Finance Minister. How many more women will end up under the axe of this Prime Minister before the leader of the NDP chooses to actually stand up and do what he needs to do and have no confidence in this Prime Minister and save our country from the disaster that's unfolding? And for the Liberals across the way, I hope somebody has found where the fire alarm is, and you're going to pull it because they got about 25 minutes of question period.
The honourable member for Niagara Falls, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Speaker. And, it's unbelievable. This Prime Minister has real difficulty when it comes to people who want to speak truth to power. When that truth is spoken, they are then subjected to being resigned from cabinet. I think the Finance Minister said it best herself. when in her resignation letter when she said, inevitably, our time in government will come to an end.
It needs to happen now.
Better words could not have been spoken. It's time for this government to resign. It's time for an election.
Hear, hear.
And if the NDP stood for workers in this country, they'd side with us, and we'd have an election called so we can replace this tired Liberal government.
Resuming.